What the fuck is wrong with the world? You think you have problems? Your car won't start? Your boss is a dick? Try watching the one person you love more than life itself be born into a silent prison, and then have every so-called expert on the planet tell you there's no key. A billionaire's autistic son was born paralyzed, a condition doctors swore would never improve. For years, specialists cashed million-dollar checks and tried every goddamn thing in the book. But the boy remained a ghost in his own body, silent and motionless. His father, one of the most powerful men on the globe, a man who could buy and sell countries, was powerless. He built state-of-the-art therapy wings that looked more like NASA command centers, flew in world-class doctors on private jets, and burned through a fortune searching for a single goddamn flicker of hope. Nothing. Fucking. Worked. Then a new maid was hired. She wasn't a nurse. She wasn't a doctor. She was just a woman with ghosts in her own eyes and a patience forged in hellfire. But within weeks, she saw something. A tiny crack in the prison wall. A flicker. A sound. A ghost of a smile that no one else had ever seen. She kept watching, quietly, piece by agonizing piece, and slowly uncovered the real, twisted reason behind the boy's condition. What she discovered would not only shock everyone to their core, but it would ignite a fire that would change the boy's life forever. Before we get into the guts of this story, do me a solid. Hit that subscribe button and pound the like icon. And hey, drop a comment below and tell us where you're watching from. We actually read that shit. Alexander Sterling was a name that once made markets tremble. A titan of industry whose face was carved onto the Mount Rushmore of capitalism. You saw him on the covers of Forbes and Fortune, a predator in a bespoke suit, a man who didn't just climb ladders but kicked them out from under everyone else. But now, at 45, Alexander was a ghost himself. He was no longer in the spotlight. He haunted the cavernous halls of his palatial estate, a fortress of solitude far from the flash of cameras and the sycophantic whispers of his peers. That mansion, a monument to his success, stuffed with priceless art and gleaming marble, felt like a tomb. It was an achingly lonely place, devoid of laughter, a gilded cage where the only sounds were the ticking of clocks and the hum of a ventilator. Alexander had amassed a world-breaking fortune with brutal strategies and an inhuman capacity for work. He sacrificed sleep, relationships, and pieces of his own soul for the next deal, the next conquest. But none of that mattered anymore. Not since his wife had been stolen from him by a sickness that even his money couldn't cure. Since then, his entire universe had collapsed into a single silent point. His son, Leo. Leo was 7 years old. He was a beautiful boy with his mother's eyes, but those eyes were vacant. Autism, Down syndrome, and a paralyzing condition that kept him locked in a wheelchair, unable to speak, unable to connect. Alexander had hired an army of specialists, bought every cutting-edge piece of medical equipment, and funded entire research departments. He had tried everything. But Leo never spoke. Not a word, not a sound. Alexander, the man who could eviscerate a corporate board with a single cold stare, felt utterly castrated. The crushing silence from his own son was a failure more profound, more painful than any market crash or hostile takeover he had ever faced. Every day was a carbon copy of the last, a brutal, monotonous ritual. He would wake before dawn, the silence of the house pressing in on him. He would carefully lift Leo from his bed, bathe him, dress him, and prepare his breakfast himself. He didn't trust a single nurse or caregiver with the intimacy of that routine. They would sit at a massive, polished mahogany table, a king and his silent prince. But Leo never looked at him. Alexander would talk to him, his voice gentle, a tone no one in the business world would have ever recognized. He'd ask questions, tell him about the birds outside the window, recount small stories from his own childhood. Leo remained perfectly still, his eyes focused on some distant point in a universe only he could see. After breakfast, Alexander would push the wheelchair into the therapy wing, a room that should have been full of joy but felt more like a laboratory. It was filled with colorful toys that were never played with, complex machines that yielded no results, and therapeutic tools that gathered dust. Therapists came and went like seasons, each with a new method, a new theory. Pictures, sounds, lights, even animal therapy. Nothing. Leo remained an unmovable, silent statue. Alexander watched every single session from behind a one-way mirror, his fists clenched, his heart a leaden weight in his chest. He was searching, begging for any reaction, a twitch, a glance, a sign that his son was still in there somewhere. Sometimes Leo would flinch at a loud noise, or his eyes would dart around the room. But he never, ever spoke. What am I doing wrong? The question was a constant, venomous whisper in his mind. He just wanted to connect. He wanted, more than his next breath, to hear his son's voice. Not for validation, not for a reward, just to know that Leo was in there, fighting, trying to get out. The silence was a physical wall, smooth and unclimbable, and Alexander was bleeding from trying to tear it down with his bare hands. His mind was a maelstrom of questions and gnawing anxieties. He devoured every article, every medical journal, every obscure book he could find about children like Leo. He flew to Switzerland for consultations, to Japan for experimental treatments, and bought every newfangled device that promised a breakthrough. He spared no expense, praying one of them would be the key. Speech therapy, music therapy, aquatic therapy, sign language. Nothing worked. Each failure was a fresh stab wound, yet he never stopped. He remembered how easily he could manipulate markets, how simple numbers and logic were. But here, with his own flesh and blood, none of it applied. Leo didn't respond to logic or yield to money. Alexander spent his nights wide awake, staring at the coffered ceiling of his bedroom, listening to the soft, rhythmic static from the baby monitor beside his bed. The fear for the future was a cold, coiling serpent in his gut. What would happen to Leo when he was gone? Who would protect him? Who would care for him with the same desperate love? The thought filled him with a primal terror he had never known. He felt helpless, a sensation so foreign and repulsive to a man who had built an empire on control. Despite the crushing weight of it all, he refused to surrender. Each morning, he started again. He talked to Leo as if he understood every syllable. He described the changing colors of the leaves, the smell of rain on the asphalt, and told him stories about his mother, about how she loved the ocean. He played classical music in the background, soft, melancholic concertos he thought Leo might feel, even if he couldn't understand. He would try new games, building block towers that Leo would never touch, hoping to spark a flicker of interest. He even started cooking elaborate meals, hoping a new smell or texture might trigger something. A smile, a noise, a glance, anything. Just give me something. But the silence was relentless. Leo showed no sign that he was listening, no indication that he was even aware of his father's desperate efforts. Alexander began to feel like he was screaming into a void, living in a world where he was the only one speaking. Yet he kept trying, not out of hope anymore, but because it was the only way he knew how to love. Silence or not, Leo was his son. Some days were harder than others. A raw, screaming frustration would well up inside him, but he always choked it down. He never raised his voice, never showed a sliver of his anger. He knew with absolute certainty it wasn't Leo's fault. When the high-priced therapists would leave, shaking their heads with pity, he wouldn't blame them. He would thank them, write the check, and immediately start searching for the next one. He was learning patience in the cruelest way imaginable. In his old life, time was money. At home, time was just waiting for a miracle that might never come. He had meetings with specialists who spoke in soft, condescending tones about acceptance and realistic expectations. Alexander would nod politely while a storm of rage brewed inside him. Deep down, in a place he rarely admitted to, he believed Leo was capable of more. He just didn't know how to unlock the door. Every small moment, a movement of Leo's hand, a slight change in his facial expression, was scrutinized, analyzed, recorded. It became his full-time obsession, more critical than any billion-dollar merger he had ever orchestrated. One afternoon, as golden sunlight streamed through the massive windows of the mansion's library, Alexander sat beside Leo. He was bone-weary, but his face was a mask of calm. He placed a small, textured ball in Leo's hand and watched. Nothing. Minutes stretched into an eternity. Then, Alexander began speaking, his voice a low murmur. He told a story about his wife, about the day he met her, how her laughter had sounded like wind chimes. He described a day they spent on a beach long ago, before the money, before the empire, before Leo. His voice was calm and steady. He didn't expect a reply. He just wanted to fill the suffocating silence. He looked at Leo and managed a gentle smile. Leo didn't look back. His eyes remained distant, lost. The ball slipped from his limp fingers and fell to the thick Persian rug with a soft thud. Alexander picked it up and placed it back in his son's hand. Still no reaction. He sighed and leaned back against the leather couch, staring at the ceiling. The silence between them stretched on. And in that silence, more than anything, Alexander felt the crushing, unbearable weight of being a father who only wanted one thing in the entire universe: to hear his son say a single word. Clara Bennett was 29 years old and walking through the wreckage of her life. Just a year ago, her newborn daughter had been ripped from her arms by a sudden, inexplicable illness. It happened in a blur of beeping machines and hushed, apologetic doctors, and nothing could have prepared her for the jagged, hollowed-out cavern of pain it left behind. Since then, Clara had been trying to just keep breathing. She didn't talk about it. The people around her, her friends, her family, tiptoed around the subject as if the mere mention of her daughter's name would shatter her completely. Their silence was worse than any words. She spent her days in a gray haze, unable to sleep, barely able to eat. After weeks of drowning in her grief, she decided she had to do something, anything, to feel the ground beneath her feet again. That's when she saw the job posting. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't a career. It was a lifeline, a position as a housemaid at the Sterling estate. Clara didn't care about the grandeur of the house or the fame of its owner. She just craved routine, quiet, a place to put one foot in front of the other without having to think. With a quiet, steely determination, she packed her 2 small suitcases and took a bus toward her new life. When Clara arrived at the mansion, the first thing she noticed was the oppressive quiet. Everything was immaculate, perfectly ordered, but the air was heavy, stagnant, like the house was holding its breath. A man greeted her at the door. Alexander Sterling. He was polite, but his eyes were like chips of ice. He spoke clearly, his voice devoid of emotion as he explained her duties and told her, in clinical terms, about his son, Leo. Clara listened without a word. She'd worked in wealthy homes before, but this felt different. As she walked through the pristine hallways, she noticed how many things were designed for a child: therapy equipment, colorful books, mountains of untouched toys. But there was no noise, no childish laughter, only a deafening stillness. Later, when she saw Leo for the first time, he was sitting in his wheelchair, staring into space, a perfect, beautiful doll. Clara didn't say anything. She simply gave a small nod to Alexander and began her tasks. She didn't feel intimidated or nervous. She felt a strange sense of purpose, as if she had been led to this quiet, sad house for a reason she didn't yet understand. Clara was not like the other staff members who had come and gone. She didn't treat Leo with the cloying, fake sweetness or the forced, high-pitched smiles. She didn't speak to him in a loud, slow voice or dangle toys in his face, desperate for a reaction. She simply did her work. She was a quiet presence in the house. Sometimes she would clean his room while he was there, moving slowly, deliberately, making sure not to startle him with loud noises or sudden movements. She noticed how easily he could become overwhelmed by sensory input, but she also saw how he seemed to relax when he was simply left alone, so she respected his space. When her tasks were finished for the day, she would sometimes pull a chair into a corner of the room where he was and just sit, reading a book or simply being present. Leo didn't look at her, but he didn't seem agitated by her presence either. Alexander watched this from a distance, puzzled. Most new hires either tried way too hard, smothering Leo with attention, or gave up within a week, frustrated by the lack of response. Clara did neither. She was just there, calmly existing in the same space, without expectation. And somehow, that began to matter. Over the next few days, Alexander started noticing infinitesimal shifts in the atmosphere. Clara was quiet, but her presence seemed to inject a different kind of energy into the mansion. It wasn't that Leo was suddenly reacting to her in any significant way. He still didn't speak, made no eye contact, and barely moved. But something felt looser. He no longer flinched when she entered a room. He didn't stiffen when she placed a clean blanket over his legs. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but Alexander felt it. One day, Clara placed a small, smooth stone on the tray of Leo's wheelchair. She didn't say a word, just left it there and went back to her dusting. Leo didn't touch it, but his eyes flickered down toward it for a few seconds longer than usual. Alexander saw it from the doorway. Clara didn't point it out, didn't make a big deal of it. She just continued her work. That simple, respectful approach was something Alexander had never seen before. It made him deeply curious about this quiet woman with sad eyes. Slowly, Alexander began to speak more with Clara. Not much at first. Small comments about the weather, polite questions about her day, but she answered with a quiet honesty and never tried to impress him. Eventually, she told him about her daughter. She didn't cry or ask for pity. She just laid out the facts of her pain, like someone who had accepted a horrific wound but was determined to keep walking. Alexander was taken aback by her raw honesty. He didn't know what to say, but Clara didn't seem to need comforting. She just needed to be heard. That made him respect her even more. Over time, Clara became more than just a maid. She became a silent, steady part of the house's rhythm. She fit into the quiet instead of trying to shatter it. Alexander, who had grown so used to his isolation with Leo, found her presence oddly comforting. He had long believed no one else could possibly understand. But Clara didn't try to understand everything. She just stayed. And that was enough. The most surprising thing happened on an otherwise ordinary afternoon. Clara was folding laundry in the living room, while Leo sat in his wheelchair nearby, staring out the window. Without thinking, she began to hum softly. It wasn't a recognizable song, just a simple, low melody. Alexander walked in and paused, expecting Leo to ignore it as he did all other sounds. But this time, Leo moved his head. It was a barely perceptible tilt, just a slight turn toward the sound. Clara didn't even look up from the towels. She just kept humming. Alexander stood frozen, not daring to breathe. After a minute, Leo's fingers twitched. Again, it was a tiny movement, but to Alexander it was an earthquake. It was the first sign that maybe, just maybe, something was finally changing. Clara didn't celebrate. She didn't exclaim, "Did you see that?" She just kept working as if nothing had happened. But in that small, quiet moment, Alexander realized the suffocating silence in his home had shifted, just a little. And it had started the day Clara arrived. Over time, Clara began to see the world through Leo's eyes. She noticed things that the endless parade of specialists, with all their charts and theories, had missed. At first, they were just tiny, unconnected details. But the more time she spent in his quiet company, the more a pattern began to emerge. Leo had his own secret language. He didn't use words or gestures, but he reacted to the world in his own subtle way. He would turn his head a fraction of an inch when he heard certain sounds. Not music or voices, but the sound of water, the gurgle of a drain, the soft patter of rain against the window pane, the distant hum of the garden sprinklers. These sounds made him seem more present, more awake. Clara started to test her theory. She would let the faucet in the kitchen run a little longer than necessary, and from the next room, she would see his fingers move. When a storm rolled in, she would crack open a window just enough to let in the sound of the rain, and Leo's posture would soften, his breathing becoming deeper and more regular. It wasn't much, but Clara was a patient observer. She didn't rush, she just watched, day by day. One sweltering afternoon, she was pushing Leo's wheelchair through the sprawling garden behind the mansion. It was a meticulously manicured space, but it felt as sterile as the rest of the house. As they moved along the stone path, Clara noticed a distinct change in Leo. He was sitting straighter, his fingers drumming a silent, slow rhythm on the armrest. She followed his gaze and saw he was staring intently at the massive swimming pool at the far end of the garden. The water shimmered under the sun, making soft, lapping noises as the filtration system circulated it. Clara stopped the wheelchair. Leo kept staring at the water. His lips, usually a neutral line, were curved into the faintest hint of a smile. His hands moved again, a small, graceful flutter, a sign of something stirring deep inside him. Clara knelt down beside him. "You like that, don't you?" she whispered. She didn't expect a reply, but she felt a powerful certainty that he had heard her. That single, simple moment filled her with a cautious hope. Maybe she had found a key. From that day on, Clara quietly amended their daily routine. Every morning, before the therapists arrived with their clipboards and futile exercises, she took Leo for a walk to the pool. She never forced it. If he seemed agitated, she wouldn't push. But most days he was calm, almost expectant. When they reached the edge, she would park his wheelchair in the shade of a large oak tree. They would just sit there for a while, listening. Sometimes the wind would ripple across the surface. Sometimes a bird would dip down for a drink. Leo still didn't speak or react in a way most people would recognize, but his entire being seemed to transform in that space. He wasn't as rigid. His fingers would move slowly, rhythmically, as if conducting the water's gentle music. His blink rate slowed. He was utterly captivated. She didn't try to intellectualize it, but it was undeniable. Something in Leo responded to the sound, the sight, the very essence of the water. As the days turned into weeks, Clara saw even more signs. Leo's shoulders, usually tense and drawn up, would relax near the pool. Once, when she dipped her hand in and created a small splash, he turned his head sharply toward the sound. It was the quickest, most deliberate reaction she had ever seen from him. She didn't make a big deal of it. She just continued, letting things unfold naturally. Sometimes she would sit beside him and tap her fingers on the edge of the pool, creating small rhythmic sounds. His breathing would slow, syncing with the rhythm. One day, while she was cleaning near the garden doors later in the afternoon, long after their morning visit to the pool, Leo made a soft, guttural sound. It wasn't a word, just a noise. But it was new. It was voluntary. Clara froze, her heart pounding. She didn't know what it meant, but it felt seismic. She didn't tell Alexander yet. She wanted to be sure. She needed more. Clara started asking herself bigger questions. What if the pool was more than just a pleasant distraction? What if it could be a bridge, a way to connect with him on a deeper level? She had read somewhere about aquatic therapy and its benefits for children with sensory issues. The feeling of weightlessness, the gentle pressure, the enveloping sound, it could be incredibly calming, even transformative. But she was terrified of getting ahead of herself, of creating false hope. She knew how easy it was to see what you wanted to see. Still, the signs were irrefutable. She considered talking to Alexander but hesitated. He had been let down by so many experts. She didn't want to be just another person with a half-baked theory that led to more heartbreak. But deep down, she knew this was different. This wasn't a guess. This was an observation. She had watched Leo for weeks, and this wasn't a coincidence. There was joy, real, quiet joy, in those small hand movements and ghost-like smiles. One morning, after a restless night, she decided she had to speak up. Alexander was in his office, buried under a mountain of paperwork. She knocked softly on the door and waited. When he looked up, she stepped inside and chose her words carefully. She told him what she had seen, how Leo responded to the pool, how his hands moved, how his body relaxed. She described the way he seemed drawn to the sound of the water. Alexander listened without interruption. His face was a stoic mask, but he didn't dismiss her. After a long, heavy pause, he said, "Let's try something." That afternoon, the three of them went out to the garden. Clara pushed Leo's wheelchair while Alexander walked beside them, his hands shoved deep in his pockets. They sat near the pool as before. Clara knelt and touched the water, making small, splashing sounds. Leo watched, just as he always did. Alexander leaned down, his eyes fixed on his son. He saw the subtle movement in the hands. He saw the faint smile. And for the first time in a very long time, he felt a dangerous, terrifying flicker of hope that maybe, just maybe, something was finally starting to change. It was a hot, late afternoon, the sun a heavy, molten ball in the sky, when Clara decided it was time. She had been thinking about it for days, a plan forming in her mind that was equal parts terrifying and exhilarating. Every visit to the pool, Leo showed more comfort, more interest. But today felt different. Today, she would close the distance. She had a small flotation vest ready. She had broached the subject with Alexander earlier in the week, and while he hadn't explicitly said yes, he hadn't said no either. His silence was her permission. She carefully, gently, helped Leo into the vest, her fingers double-checking every strap, ensuring it was snug and secure. He didn't resist, which felt like a victory in itself. With slow, deliberate movements, she sat on the top step of the pool, holding him close against her side. Then, with one arm wrapped tightly around his small torso, she slowly descended into the water, bringing them both into the cool, blue embrace for the very first time. Leo's body reacted instantly. His muscles seized, his arms tensed, and his shoulders shot up toward his ears. Clara held him tighter. "It's okay, I've got you," she whispered, her voice a low, steady anchor in his new, uncertain world. She didn't rush. They stayed on the steps for a long moment, letting him acclimate to the strange, new sensation. The water lapped at his chest, and she could feel a fine tremor run through his body. But he didn't cry out. He didn't panic. Slowly, his body began to yield. Clara moved backward, just an inch at a time, letting the water bear more of his weight. The vest kept him buoyant, and her arm was an iron band around his waist. After a few more seconds, a change occurred. His shoulders dropped. His hands, no longer clenched, began to move through the water, his fingers splayed. His head tilted back. And then, out of the silent, blue stillness, he let out a small, sharp laugh. It was a short, clear, explosive giggle. Clara froze, her own breath catching in her throat. Her eyes went wide. She had never, not once, heard that sound from him. Her heart felt like it was going to beat its way out of her chest. For a moment she was paralyzed, unsure of what to do. Her chest tightened with a strange, painful mixture of elation and fear. She didn't want to frighten him by overreacting, but she couldn't contain it. Her eyes filled with tears, and a choked, quiet laugh escaped her own lips. She kept holding him, floating slowly, moving in small, gentle circles. Leo didn't laugh again, but a look of serene calm settled on his face. He seemed to be reveling in the feeling. His fingers traced patterns on the surface of the water, splashing just a little. Clara watched every tiny movement as if it were the most miraculous event in human history. She thought of all the days, all the hours, she had sat by this pool with him, hoping, praying for something, for anything, and now here he was, floating, relaxed, laughing. It was just one sound, but to her it was everything. She whispered to him again, her voice thick with emotion. "You did it, Leo, you really did it." Alexander hadn't planned to go outside. He was supposed to be on a conference call, but something had pulled him away from his desk, a strange unease that made him walk to the window. He had seen Clara leading Leo toward the pool and had felt a familiar knot of anxiety tighten in his stomach. Now, drawn by a force he couldn't name, he stepped outside and followed the path. As he reached the edge of the manicured lawn, he stopped dead. There, in the shimmering blue water, was his son, floating, held gently by Clara. He couldn't move. His eyes were locked on Leo's face. He saw the way his son's hands moved through the water. He saw the way Clara held him with such profound, gentle care. And then he heard it. A sound that pierced through years of silence. Leo laughed again. Just once, short and light. It was faint, but it was unmistakable. Alexander's heart hammered against his ribs. He couldn't believe it. His son was laughing in the water, with her. At first, his reaction was a confusing jumble of emotions. He didn't know what to feel. He had always been so fiercely protective, so cautious, so controlling. He never fully trusted anyone with Leo. And now, here was this woman, this maid, doing something he had never dared to do. She had taken his son into the water without hesitation. She had made him laugh. Alexander took a tentative step closer, careful not to disturb the sacred moment. He kept watching, a profound realization dawning on him. His fear, the fear that something would go wrong, that Leo would be hurt, that no one could possibly understand, began to recede. He saw that Clara wasn't forcing anything. She was calm, patient, her entire focus on Leo. She was helping him feel safe. A hard lump formed in his throat. He had waited years for a sign, any sign, And it wasn't happening in a sterile therapy room or with a world-renowned doctor. It was happening right here, in his own backyard, with a woman who simply, profoundly cared. As Clara turned towards the garden, she saw Alexander standing there and froze for a heartbeat. But then she gave him a small, gentle nod, as if seeking his silent blessing. He didn't speak. He just nodded back and walked a little closer, still keeping his distance. Leo didn't seem to notice his father. He was lost in the water, in the sensation of floating, in the security of Clara's arm around him. Richard sat down heavily on a nearby lounge chair, watching the scene unfold. He didn't try to take over. He didn't issue instructions. He just watched. The dynamic between him and Clara had always been defined by unspoken rules and formal boundaries. But in that moment, all of that dissolved. This wasn't about employer and employee anymore. This was about Leo. And for the first time, Leo was smiling. As Julia continued to move slowly through the water with the boy, her face a portrait of soft, emotional focus, Alexander sat there and finally understood. This wasn't just a swim. It was a baptism, the beginning of something far bigger than his fear. Alexander walked slowly toward the edge of the pool. His steps were measured, but his heart was a chaotic drum against his ribs. He had just witnessed his son laugh for the first time. That alone had shattered something deep inside him. Now, as he drew closer, his gaze was fixed on Leo. The boy was still floating, cradled by Clara, who held him with a preternatural calm. Alexander didn't want to break the spell. He stayed silent, watching every breath, every small movement. Clara didn't say a word. She kept Leo close, her hands a steady, reassuring presence. Then, something happened that defied every medical report, every dire prognosis he had ever received. As Alexander stood at the pool's edge, Leo turned his head. It was a slow, deliberate motion. Their eyes met. And then, in a soft, raspy voice, Leo said, "Daddy." One word. It was quiet, barely more than a whisper, but it was as clear and sharp as a shard of glass. Alexander froze. His entire body went rigid. His eyes widened. He had waited 7 years, 2 months, and 11 days for this. The word echoed in the chambers of his mind. Daddy. He couldn't process it. He stared at Leo, desperate, terrified that it was a hallucination, an auditory mirage born of years of longing. But it was real. It had happened. His legs buckled. He dropped to his knees at the water's edge, his hands trembling violently. He didn't care that the knees of his expensive trousers were soaking through. Tears, hot and uncontrollable, streamed down his face. Years of dammed-up pain, frustration, fear, and utter helplessness burst forth in a silent, racking sob. He had lived in the suffocating silence for so long, had told himself he had accepted it. But now, with that one single word, his entire world had been remade. Clara remained perfectly still in the water, her arms a protective circle around Leo. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. Her eyes met Alexander's over the boy's head, and in that shared gaze, the monumental weight of the moment was understood. Nothing needed to be said. Leo didn't repeat the word, but he looked calm. His fingers were still tracing patterns in the water, and his breathing was even. He didn't seem frightened or confused. In fact, he looked more present, more there than Alexander had ever seen him. Alexander wiped his face with the back of his hand, trying to get his breathing under control. He looked at his son again, memorizing every detail of his face. Leo hadn't just reacted to the water. He had made a connection. He had looked at his father and chosen to speak. That one act meant more than 1,000 therapy reports. He reached out a trembling hand and gently touched Leo's. Leo didn't pull away. He let his father's hand rest there, soft and light. Alexander turned his gaze to Clara, his voice a broken whisper. "Thank you." She simply nodded once, her expression gentle and unwavering. He remained on the ground beside the pool, unwilling to move. He wanted to stay in this moment forever. He watched his son floating, held safely in Clara's arms, and for the first time since Leo's birth, he didn't feel powerless. He felt connected. A critical realization began to crystallize in his mind. Leo had never been incapable. He had never been completely locked away. He had just never felt safe enough to emerge. It wasn't about teaching him or fixing him. It was about giving him the space to be himself. A space without pressure, without expectation. A space where his silence wasn't seen as a failure. Clara had created that space, with simple patience, with quiet presence, with unconditional calm. Alexander had spent a fortune chasing answers in sterile clinics and from detached experts, but the answer had been something so much smaller, so much quieter. It was the freedom to feel safe. He watched Leo move in the water, and for the first time, he truly believed. Julia continued to float with Noah for a few more minutes, her movements slow and graceful. She could feel the change in the boy's body. He trusted her completely. He was not just tolerating this experience, he was participating in it. She looked at Richard again, and this time she saw something new in his tear-streaked face. It wasn't just shock, it was understanding. He finally saw what she had been sensing for weeks. That Leo wasn't unreachable. That the silence wasn't a wall, but a shield. And now, for the first time, that shield had begun to lower. They stayed in that tableau a little longer, the world seeming to hold its breath around them. Leo had spoken, not just with a word, but with his entire being. And that single moment had changed the trajectory of all their lives. As the sun began to bleed into the horizon, Clara slowly guided Leo to the steps. She helped him out gently, wrapping him in a large, fluffy towel she had placed nearby. Alexander stood, took the towel from her, and finished drying his son, his movements tender and silent. Together they dressed him and placed him back in his wheelchair. Leo was calm, his eyes alert and bright. Alexander looked down at him, his heart still reeling. One word had shattered years of silence, and in its place, a new world of possibility had opened. He looked at Clara, and a profound shift occurred within him. She was no longer an employee. She was the architect of a miracle. She had reached his son when no one else could. And right there, as the last rays of sunlight painted the garden in gold, Alexander understood that something had awakened today. In Leo, in himself, and in Clara. Something real, something alive. The pool became the heart of the house. What was once a symbol of sterile, untouchable wealth was now the center of Leo's universe. Each morning, he would point a determined finger toward the glass doors of the garden. He developed a new habit of tapping the armrest of his wheelchair, his eyes fixed on Clara, a silent, urgent request. She always understood. Alexander watched this transformation with a quiet, reverent awe. Leo, who had once been a passive observer of his own life, now had something he actively looked forward to. The moment they were outside, Leo's entire demeanor would change. He'd sit up straighter, his eyes would focus, and his hands would move in the air with a gentle, flowing motion. He began to make soft, humming sounds as they approached the water, his own unique expression of excitement. Alexander started joining them regularly, no longer a distant observer but a quiet participant, sitting on the edge of the pool, absorbing every tiny piece of progress as if it were a sacred text. Clara, ever intuitive, began to build on this foundation. She introduced simple water games with floating toys, soft sponges, colorful balls, a squeaky rubber duck. She played calm, ambient music on a small, portable speaker, sometimes humming along. Leo responded. He started reaching for the toys, splashing with more intention, and his rare laughs became more frequent. The yellow duck became his favorite. He would hold it for long periods, watching it bob on the water with intense focus. Clara noticed and made it a central part of their time together. She also brought out laminated picture books, reading to him at the water's edge. She would point to the pictures, naming them, and he would respond by touching the images, making small sounds, or tapping the pages. These were no longer random movements. They were answers. Communication had begun. Then, during one of those sun-drenched afternoon sessions, something incredible happened. Clara was sitting on a towel beside the pool, with Leo in his chair next to her. She handed him the familiar yellow duck. Leo looked at it, then looked up at her. He pointed a small finger at the toy and said, with surprising clarity, "Duck." Clara froze. She wasn't sure she had heard him right. "Duck," she repeated gently, pointing to it again. Leo looked at the toy and gave a small, decisive nod. "Duck," he said again. It was the second word he had ever spoken. A wide, brilliant smile broke across Clara's face as she fought back tears. She turned to Alexander, who had seen and heard everything from just a few feet away. His expression was a mixture of shock, joy, and profound disbelief. He walked over and knelt beside his son. "That's right, Leo," he said, his voice thick. "Duck." It was a moment of pure, unadulterated triumph, not because of the word itself, but because it was proof. Leo was learning. He was choosing to connect. After that day, the sessions by the pool became even more sacred. Alexander cleared his schedule every afternoon. He no longer watched from the sidelines. He got involved. He'd sit on the ground with them, reading stories, his voice animated. He'd help dry off the toys. He even got into the shallow end of the pool, letting Leo splash him. Clara continued to guide their interactions, never pushing, always letting Leo set the pace. The boy responded with more smiles, more sounds, and more direct eye contact than ever before. Words were still rare, but his communication was blossoming. When he was happy, he would flap his hands and let out joyful squeals. When he was confused, he would look directly at Clara for guidance. When he liked a story, he would touch the page and give a small, rumbling laugh. These were milestones more significant than any quarterly report. The pool area had become more than a playground. It was a sanctuary. It was where Leo felt safe, connected, and free. Clara started a notebook, documenting every new sound, every gesture, every response. She shared it with Alexander each evening, and they would discuss new strategies, new books, new toys. They were a team, united in their focus on what brought Leo joy. One day, Clara brought out non-toxic finger paints and a large plastic mat. She guided Leo's hands into the cool, slick paint, and to their astonishment, he didn't pull away. He smeared blue and yellow across the paper, a look of intense concentration on his face. He even smiled when Alexander, feeling adventurous, dipped his own fingers into the paint. Another time, they played with bubbles, and Leo reached for them with uninhibited excitement. These weren't just fun activities. They were building blocks of communication, teaching him cause and effect, texture and expression. His own unique language was becoming clearer every day. The words still came slowly, but Alexander and Clara had learned to listen with more than just their ears. They understood the pauses, the hand movements, the quiet laughs. It was a new language, one built on a foundation of patience and absolute trust. For the first time, Leo wasn't being taught how to conform. He was being supported in being himself. And in that shift, Alexander finally, truly understood. His son didn't need to be fixed. He just needed to be heard. He needed them to meet him where he was, and Clara had built the bridge. That afternoon, as the three of them sat by the pool, Leo leaned his head tiredly against Clara's arm. She smiled and stroked his hair. Alexander smiled too. The words were still precious and few, but the connection was deep and unbreakable. The boy was finally being heard. While organizing some long-neglected shelves in Alexander's home office, Clara stumbled upon a locked filing cabinet. Curiosity piqued, she found the key in the top drawer of his desk and opened it. Inside were dozens of old folders. Most were mundane business records, but one, tucked in the back, was labeled Leo Sterling, Medical History. She hesitated for only a moment before opening it. Inside, she found years of reports from a neurologist who had treated Leo from infancy. As she read, her expression shifted from curiosity to horror. The reports were filled with cold, clinical language that made her blood run cold. Words like emotional containment, compliance reinforcement, and behavioral suppression were used repeatedly. The doctor had prescribed a cocktail of heavy sedatives and antipsychotics for years, not for any therapeutic benefit, but for control. Clara's hands began to tremble as she read on. There were notes about limiting sensory stimuli, isolating Leo during episodes, and even restricting physical contact to prevent attachment disorders. The reports painted a picture of a cold, inhuman protocol. Something was horribly, fundamentally wrong. The more pages she turned, the sicker she felt. One report detailed the use of a restraint chair during sessions to ensure safety and limit resistance. There were notes from the doctor asserting that Leo's silence was a permanent cognitive deficit and that language development is highly unlikely. But what chilled her to the bone was how readily all of this had been accepted. Leo hadn't been treated like a child. He had been treated like a problem to be managed. Clara dug deeper. She searched the neurologist's name online, and a dark history began to unfold. She found articles, forum posts, and even medical board complaints. To her horror, she discovered several other families had come forward with similar stories. Children over-medicated into a stupor. Kids who had suffered devastating side effects, both physical and emotional. The doctor had faced investigations, but had always managed to continue practicing. Clara felt a wave of nausea. She closed the folder and sat in the silent office, her mind reeling. She couldn't keep this to herself. Later that evening, after Leo was asleep, she walked into Alexander's study, the folder clutched in her hand. He was on the couch, reading, and looked up at her grave expression. She sat across from him, and, her voice steady despite her racing heart, began to explain everything she had found. She read him the most damning excerpts from the reports, and showed him the articles she had printed. Alexander listened, his face slowly draining of color. The book slid from his lap as he sat forward, his elbows on his knees, his head in his hands. He had trusted that doctor implicitly. He had believed he was providing the best possible care for his son. Now, the horrifying truth crashed down on him. He had not only allowed, but paid for treatments that had likely hurt, silenced, and imprisoned his own child. A monstrous, suffocating guilt began to crawl up his throat. His voice was a broken rasp when he finally looked at her. How? How could I have not known? Clara saw the agony in his eyes and understood. It was easy to trust the men in white coats, with their confident smiles and alphabet of degrees, but it was time to act. Alexander agreed without hesitation. They couldn't stay silent. Together they began to form a plan. First, they meticulously gathered every document, printed every article, and saved every testimony from other families they could find. Then, they contacted a top lawyer specializing in medical malpractice. They also reached out to an investigative journalist known for exposing systemic corruption. This was bigger than Leo now. This was about ensuring no other child would endure the same nightmare. The process was slow and emotionally grueling. They gave depositions, wrote statements, and supported the burgeoning investigation. Every time they reviewed the files, Alexander felt the guilt return, a fresh, sharp stab. But he didn't run from it. He faced it head on. This was his chance to atone, to fix what he had so blindly allowed. This wasn't about revenge. It was about truth. At home, amidst the storm of legal preparations, life with Leo continued to move forward. They shielded him from the tension, becoming more present with him than ever. Every small moment felt precious, and Leo kept blossoming. He still preferred gestures and sounds, but now he made eye contact more frequently. He would point to things he wanted, and even tried new words occasionally. One day by the pool, he said, "ball," while holding one. Another time, he reached for a book and said, "read." Each new word was a testament to the bright, curious mind that had been trapped for so long. He wasn't broken. He had never been. Alexander looked at his son differently now, not with pity, but with a profound respect. The trauma of the past was real, but it would not define Leo's future. That future was still a blank page. Months passed. The case gained momentum. New stories were published, and more families came forward, empowered by Alexander's resources and Clara's quiet determination. The doctor's license was suspended pending the outcome of the investigation. Alexander and Clara were called to speak publicly, and though it was painful, they didn't flinch. They spoke for Leo and for every child who had ever been treated like a diagnosis instead of a person. At home, their bond deepened. They were no longer employer and employee. They were partners, a team united by their fierce love for a little boy. And Leo, blissfully unaware of the battle being waged in his name, kept discovering his world. His smile came more easily. He laughed more freely. And one evening, when he looked at Clara and said her name for the first time, it was clear to both of them. This boy, once silenced by malpractice and misunderstanding, was finally finding his voice. Slowly but surely, Leo was being set free. With the backing of other parents, Alexander and Clara pushed forward, their quiet search for answers now a public crusade for justice. They met with families who shared harrowing stories of mistreatment by the same doctor, compiling a mountain of evidence, medical records, prescription histories, personal testimonies, and expert opinions. A team of investigative journalists took the story and ran with it, publishing a series of explosive reports. The truth began to spread like wildfire. News channels picked up the scandal, and online platforms amplified the family's voices. The doctor was officially named, accused of unethical practices and gross patient neglect. The state medical board launched a full-scale investigation, and the pressure became immense. None of it would have been possible without the relentless work of Alexander and Clara. As the storm raged in the outside world, a quiet revolution was taking place inside the mansion. While lawyers called and journalists clamored for statements, Leo continued his peaceful journey of discovery. His progress was steady and beautiful to watch. Clara began to notice his drawings evolving. At first they were just abstract lines and scribbles, but slowly colors began to appear. He favored blue, yellow, and green. He chose them with a clear sense of purpose. Alexander started hanging the drawings on the wall near the pool. One day Leo said, "Water," while holding a blue crayon. Another day, he looked out the window and said, "Sun." Then, one evening, completely unprompted, he said, "Mom." It was soft and quick, but Clara heard it. Alexander, standing in the doorway, heard it too. They looked at each other, their hearts full, a silent acknowledgement of the monumental journey they had all been on. These words weren't coming from flashcards or therapy drills. They were coming from inside Leo himself. The same boy who had once lived in a world without words was now expressing thoughts, memories, feelings. He wasn't being taught how to speak. He was simply being given the space to bloom. One afternoon, while Clara was organizing books and Alexander was reviewing legal documents, Leo padded into the room holding a piece of paper. He had been drawing for over an hour. Clara smiled. "Do you want to show us what you made?" Leo walked slowly toward them and held up the paper. On it were 3 simple stick figures holding hands. One was tall with short hair, one had long hair, and the one in the middle was smaller, with a round face and curly scribbles on its head. The meaning was instantly, powerfully clear. Clara crouched down. "Who are these, sweetie?" she asked softly. Leo looked at his drawing, then at both of them. "It's us," he said. His voice was quiet, but the words were a thunderclap. Clara's eyes filled with tears. She covered her mouth with her hand and nodded. Alexander was speechless. He just stared at the drawing, a deep, overwhelming wave of emotion washing over him. Clara sat on the floor beside Leo and hugged him gently. He didn't pull away. He rested his head on her shoulder for a few seconds before returning to his crayons. Alexander remained quiet, watching them. The silence he had once feared so deeply had transformed into something beautiful. Not every day was a breakthrough. There were still quiet days, moments of frustration. But that was okay. The difference was that now they understood. They knew how to listen, even when there were no words. Alexander felt a pride that was deeper and more profound than anything his business success had ever given him. Julia had become more than a support. She was family. She had helped him rebuild a world he thought was lost forever. Their lives were irrevocably changed. The house, once a cold, silent museum, was now a home, filled with color, noise, and connection. The past hadn't disappeared. Sometimes Alexander would look at the old medical files and feel the weight of his unwitting complicity. Julia still had quiet moments where she mourned her daughter. But they didn't let the pain define them. They used it. They continued working with the other families, attending support meetings, and providing updates on the case. They spoke at events, sharing their story to help others. They had turned something dark into a beacon of hope. Inside the house, life had never been more vibrant. The kitchen often echoed with Leo's laughter. The living room was a happy mess of toys and books. The walls were a gallery of Leo's art. Music often played in the background, and on quiet days they would just sit by the pool, listening to the water. Richard no longer ran from the memories of what he had lost. Julia no longer hid from her feelings. And Leo, the quiet center of their universe, had found his place. The day he showed them the drawing and said, "It's us," something shifted forever. It was proof. The silence was no longer an enemy. This house, once a vessel of loneliness, now held love. The past had left its scars, but the present was finally home. The trial against the neurologist became a national spectacle. Once the first reports aired, a floodgate opened. More and more families came forward, each with a unique, painful story of betrayal. The courtroom was packed for every hearing. Parents testified, their voices shaking with grief and anger, describing how their children had been misdiagnosed, over-medicated, and restrained. The evidence was damning. Medical records, expert testimonies, and internal documents revealed a clear, shocking pattern of neglect and abuse for profit. Alexander and Clara were there every single day. They spoke calmly and firmly, their testimony a powerful anchor for the prosecution. The public reaction was visceral. When the final verdict came down, it was decisive. The doctor was found guilty on multiple counts and sentenced to prison. It was a landmark moment of justice, not just for Leo, but for every child who had ever suffered in silence. Richard and Clara didn't celebrate with champagne, but as they walked out of the courthouse, they both felt a heavy, years-long weight lift from their shoulders. Back at home, life was a world away from the chaos of the trial. The mansion, once a monument to silence, now hummed with a soft, happy energy. Shortly after the legal proceedings began, Alexander had made a decision. He converted a cavernous, unused ballroom into a magnificent art studio just for Leo. He had the walls painted a brilliant white and installed massive skylights. There were shelves overflowing with paints, crayons, markers, and colored paper. A low table and child-sized chairs made it easy for Leo to create. The first time Leo walked into the room, his eyes lit up with a pure, unadulterated joy. He ran his fingers along the shelves, picked out a crayon, and immediately began to draw. It became his sanctuary. He would spend hours in there, drawing shapes, people, animals, and the things he loved most. Water, the sun, and his favorite color, which he called pool blue. Clara had become the heart of their home. Her bond with Leo was a beautiful, powerful thing to witness. She knew his moods, his needs, his silent cues. She encouraged him without ever pushing. Some days she would sing softly while he drew. Other times, they would paint side by side or read books sprawled on the floor. Leo began naming colors without being asked. Red, he'd say, pointing. Yellow. And his favorite, pool blue. He'd press the turquoise crayon hard against the paper, scribbling with excitement. Alexander often found himself standing quietly in the doorway of the studio, a cup of coffee in his hand, just watching them. He didn't interrupt. He just soaked it in, filled with a gratitude so profound it often brought tears to his eyes. Leo's world was no longer confined to therapy rooms. He explored the garden, played with toys, and made messes in the kitchen while helping Clara bake cookies. His laughter filled the spaces that had once felt so achingly empty. Alexander realized his home had been transformed. There were signs of life everywhere. Art on the refrigerator, toys under the coffee table, a half-finished puzzle on the floor. It no longer felt like a museum. It felt lived in. It felt warm. He started to smile more, not the tight, polite smile of a CEO, but a genuine smile that reached his eyes. He had been through hell, but his house was now filled with the one thing he thought he had lost forever. Joy. Real, messy, imperfect joy. Without ever needing to say the words, the three of them had become a family. There were no labels, no expectations. They found their rhythm in the small, quiet moments, shared meals, afternoon walks, story time before bed. Each of them carried scars from the past, but together they were creating something new and beautiful. One afternoon, Leo drew a picture of three people sitting under a bright yellow sun. He pointed to the tallest figure and said, "Daddy." Then to the one with long hair, "Clara." And finally to the smallest one, "Me." Alexander framed that drawing and kept it on his desk. It was a daily reminder that love could grow in the most broken of places. It didn't have to look like anyone else's story. It just had to be real. There was no perfect storybook ending. But there was something better. There was stability, a peaceful home, a new rhythm. Richard still had moments of guilt, and Clara still had moments of grief. But those moments no longer defined them. What defined them now was the way they looked at each other across the dinner table, the way Leo reached for their hands when they walked through the yard. The house, once so cold, was now full of meaning. Alexander didn't need to chase answers anymore. He just needed to be here, and as he stood one afternoon, watching Clara and Leo laugh together under the sun, he realized something simple and profound. Love had arrived, quietly, without fanfare, not as a reward, but as a result of truth, care, and time. Years passed. The quiet afternoons by the pool evolved into a life filled with sound, color, and laughter. Leo was no longer the small, silent boy. He had grown into a remarkable young man with a sharp wit, a passion for art, and a voice he now used with confidence. His story had spread, becoming a quiet legend of hope and resilience. Tonight, a large auditorium was filled to capacity. Families, doctors, and advocates from across the country had gathered for an event celebrating stories of overcoming adversity. Leo was one of the evening's honorees. Dressed in a sharp suit the color of pool blue, he waited backstage with Clara. He wasn't nervous. He was beaming. His hands fidgeted slightly, but his smile was wide and genuine. Clara looked at him, her heart swelling with a love so fierce it almost hurt. She adjusted his collar, her touch as gentle and patient as it had been all those years ago. When his name was called, Leo walked onto the stage, holding Clara's hand. The entire audience rose to their feet in a thunderous ovation before he even reached the microphone. The stage lights were bright, but he didn't flinch. He stood tall, looking out at the sea of faces without fear. A medal was placed around his neck, a symbol of a journey that had begun in silence. Clara stood beside him, tears already streaming down her face. Alexander was in the front row, clapping so hard his hands stung, a proud, brilliant smile on his face. But what happened next stunned everyone into silence. The presenter cleared his throat and held up a paper. "Tonight," he announced, his voice booming through the auditorium, "we honor not just Leo's incredible journey, but the person who walked every single step of it with him. Please join me in officially recognizing Clara Bennett as the adoptive mother and legal guardian of Leo Sterling." The room went utterly still. Clara covered her mouth with both hands, a sob escaping her lips. She had never asked for anything. She had never wanted a title or a ceremony. She had just wanted to be there for the boy who had healed her as much as she had helped him. But standing there, the words echoing in her ears, she felt a profound tectonic shift. Leo turned to her and wrapped his arms around her in a fierce hug. It wasn't just a hug. It was an anchor. It was gratitude, trust, and a love deeper than any ocean. Clara cried openly, her body trembling. She rested her forehead against Leo's, whispering, "Thank you." In the audience, Alexander was the first to his feet, clapping with all his might. The rest of the room followed, the applause a deafening, joyful wave of sound. They stayed in that embrace for a long moment before the host handed Leo a small piece of paper. It was time for his speech. He walked to the microphone, held the paper in both hands, and looked out at the crowd. He took a deep breath. Then, in a voice that was clear, calm, and carried to every corner of the room, he said, "My light started at the pool." He turned and pointed to Clara, his smile radiant. "With her." There were no other words. Just that. Simple. True. The room went quiet again, holding its breath. Then, the applause erupted once more, louder this time, filled with cheers and emotion. Alexander sat back down, wiping his eyes, completely overwhelmed. This was the moment he had barely dared to dream of during all those dark, silent years. His son was not just being seen. He was being heard, celebrated, and understood, completely on his own terms. After the ceremony, people lined up to meet them. Parents with tears in their eyes thanked them. Strangers told them how their story had given them hope. Richard stood beside them, no longer a titan of industry, but simply Leo's father. The three of them stood together, an undeniable unit, a family forged in the crucible of silence and redeemed by love. As they left the event and got into the car, Leo held his medal in one hand and Clara's hand in the other. Richard drove, glancing at them in the rear-view mirror. The silence between them was comfortable, full, and peaceful. When they got home, Leo placed the medal on the table next to his old drawing, the one of the three of them holding hands. Clara looked at it and smiled. Richard put his arm around her, and Leo leaned against both of them. Finally, completely home. We've reached the end of this incredible story. I can't thank you enough for sticking with us to the very end. What did you think? What was the moment that hit you the hardest? Drop a comment below and let us know. And please, don't forget to subscribe. Until next time.